Mark Vincent was a man who lived in shadows, though the world insisted on bathing him in the harshest light. At 42, his name was among the most formidable in Chicago's real estate empire. Skyscrapers bore the weight of his investments. Entire neighborhoods carried the imprint of his decisions. If a deal was impossible, Mark Vincent could close it with a single word. He was the undisputed king of the city's skyline, if power were measured in steel and glass. And yet, no throne had ever felt colder. They called him the Iron King, the man who couldn't smile and the ghost in the boardroom. Behind his back, people whispered the words with relish. In elegant cocktail parties, in marble halls, and glittering ballrooms, his name slipped from lips not with admiration, but with a peculiar mix of fear, envy, and fascination. The whispers were always the same: ruthless, cold, untouchable. But Mark knew better. What they meant was unwanted. It stretched from the crest of his left cheekbone down to the edge of his jawline, pale against olive-toned skin. Once, it had been an angry wound from the night a 17-year-old boy lost control of a car on black ice, his fault. No one else had been injured, but the boy who stepped out of the wreckage had been marked forever. Mark Vincent had been beautiful once, the kind of boy who could steal glances without trying, who made girls laugh too loudly in crowded diners, who felt invincible in the glow of youth. But the accident had stolen all of that. Not just his looks, but something far more profound. First, it changed how people looked at him. Stares carried pity and curiosity. Sometimes a flicker of revulsion quickly masked. Then it changed the way he looked at himself. Over time, every smile offered to him began to feel calculated. Every woman who touched his arm seemed to weigh his bank account in the same breath. The scar became more than skin deep. It became a wall. Behind it, Mark locked away his heart piece by piece until nothing remained but disciplined control and the ice-cold certainty of transactions. Love was not for him. Companionship was an illusion. And so he let the world believe in the Iron King, because it was easier than admitting the truth. He was a man who had forgotten how to be wanted for who he was. Chicago adored spectacle. But for Mark, the city had become a theater of silence. He inhabited the top floors of a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, where the water stretched like steel beneath the sky. His home was flawless, designed by the best architects his money could summon, floor-to-ceiling glass-polished stone-curated art that critics fawned over. Yet the silence in those rooms was suffocating. No laughter echoed against the glass. No warmth lingered in the air. Only the clock ticking seemed to grow louder with every passing year. Mark filled that silence with work. He conquered deal after deal, collected skyscrapers like trophies, and pushed himself harder than men half his age. In the mirror, he saw the scar. But in boardrooms, he saw numbers, contracts, profits. They were easier to face. But there were nights, rare, unguarded moments, when the quiet pressed too heavily against his chest. When the city's lights below blurred into meaningless glitter, he wondered if this was all life would ever be. Power without presence. Wealth without warmth. Victory without love. Daniel Pierce was the exception. Mark had known him long before the scar, when they were just ambitious young men trying to leave their mark on the world. Unlike most, Daniel never flinched. His warmth, charisma, and effortless way of drawing people close had balanced Mark's silence for decades. Daniel was one of the few left who still called Mark a friend. And it was for Daniel that Mark reluctantly pressed a hand to his charcoal suit jacket one late autumn evening, preparing to attend a celebration he would rather have skipped. The invitation had been grand, as Daniel's gestures always were: 50th birthday celebration, Skyline Tower Hotel. An evening of champagne and string quartets with Chicago glittering like a jewel box beneath the glass rooftop. Mark had intended to arrive late, make his appearance, offer his gift, and retreat into the night before the crowd could dissect his presence too closely. That was how he attended parties now, always with one foot out the door. But that evening fate had other plans. He was halfway across the rooftop ballroom when it happened. He was moving toward the bay, one momenter, head slightly bowed to discourage idle chatter. Next, a small figure backed directly into him. A camera nearly slipped from her hands, but Mark's sharp, disciplined, controlled reflexes snapped into action. He steadied both her and the strap in a single motion, preventing what would have been a disastrous fall. "Oh, I'm so sorry," the woman exclaimed, turning quickly. Her words faltered mid-breath as their eyes met, and Mark braced himself. He had lived this moment 1,000 times. The flicker in the eyes, the darting glance at his scar, the subtle tightening of lips in pity, or the too careful pretense of pretending it wasn't there. But this time it didn't come. Her gaze didn't flinch. It didn't linger either. She looked at him directly, steadily, as though his face were the most natural thing in the world. Mark felt the ground shift beneath him. She was stunning, but not in the polished, artificial way of the women who usually circled his orbit. Her beauty was alive, grounded, magnetic, skin the color of warm bronze beneath the rooftop lights, high cheekbones that gave her face elegance, a graceful neck, and eyes so deep and alert they seemed capable of reading a room in an instant. Her hair was pulled back into a practical knot, though a few strands had escaped, softening her face. She wore a simple black dress that allowed her to move easily, not a statement gown, but something that whispered quiet confidence. And when she smiled, it was genuine. Not a society smile, not a transactional smile. Just real. "Are you all right?" Mark asked before he could stop himself. "Yes," she replied, adjusting the camera. "Thank you for catching that. It would have been, well, costly." Her voice was warm, low, unhurried. She wasn't rushing to fill the air or tripping over herself to impress him. There was no false flattery, no angled curiosity, just presence. "Mark Vincent," he said, offering his hand. "Lynn Abhaya," she replied, shaking it firmly. Her grip was confident, not dainty. For a brief moment, they stood still, the buzz of the party carrying around them, and Mark felt something he hadn't felt in years. Ease. She wasn't measuring him. She wasn't looking past him toward the gleam of his watch or the cut of his suit. She was there. And somehow, that was more memorable than any flirtation he'd ever encountered. The rest of the evening unfolded as expected. Mark exchanged pleasantries with Daniel, lifted a champagne flute he didn't finish, and nodded politely at acquaintances who spoke too quickly. But his eyes kept finding her. Lynn. She moved through the crowd, quietly adjusting lenses, leaning over railings for skyline shots, speaking briefly with guests. She was immersed in her work, yet every movement seemed infused with focus and poise. Unbothered by the glittering wealth around her, she stood apart. She belonged not because of what she wore or who she knew, but because of how she carried herself. By the time Mark slipped into the quiet luxury of his black sedan later that night, he was unsettled. Not because she had mistreated him, but because she had treated him no differently than anyone else. No flinch, no mask, no agenda. Just Lynn Abhaya. And for a man who had lived decades behind walls of suspicion and silence, that was dangerous. Because deep down in a place he hadn't touched in years, Mark Vincent wanted to see her again. Mark didn't believe in fate. Deals were forged in contracts, not destiny. Futures were built in steel, not in stars. And yet, as his car slid through the Chicago night, the city lights blurring past the tinted windows, one thought rooted itself stubbornly inside him. This was not the last time he would see Lynn Abhaya. And perhaps, She was the one person who might one day see past the scar. Don't let it fade if you felt the stirrings of this story, the chill of his loneliness, the unexpected spark of their first meeting. Leave a like, share your thoughts in a comment, and follow the channel so you can walk beside Mark and Lynn as their journey unfolds. Every reaction you give keeps these stories alive, weaving the threads that connect us to love, resilience, and the courage to be seen. For 3 days after the party, Mark Vincent tried to bury himself in work. Contracts piled high on his desk. Developers demanded signatures. Bankers wanted calls returned, and city officials pressed for negotiations on a new downtown project. His days followed the rhythm he knew best: decisions, numbers, deals, and the relentless pulse of business. It should have been enough. For years, this was how he drowned out the silence, by filling it with victories. But the silence had changed. Now it was haunted by the echo of a voice, low and warm, by a smile that didn't hide calculation, by a pair of steady eyes that had looked at him not as a man of wealth or scars, but as a man. Lynn Abhaya. The name repeated itself in his mind, though he hadn't spoken it aloud since that night. He told himself it was nothing, just an unusual encounter at a rooftop party. And yet, his thoughts betrayed him. He remembered the sure grip of her handshake, unhesitant, the way she moved with quiet poise, unbothered by the swirl of affluence around her. He remembered how she had smiled, not the brittle smile he'd grown accustomed to, but one that reached her eyes. He had been watched his entire life, but that evening he had felt seen for the first time in years. It unsettled him. Mark Vincent was not a man who indulged in distractions. He had trained himself to compartmentalize, to set aside whatever did not serve the purpose of power. His scar had taught him discipline, and his fortune had demanded it. But now, when the skyline lit itself in steel and gold outside his penthouse windows every evening, he found his gaze drifting away from contracts and the endless calculations of profit and risk. Instead, he recalled the texture of her voice and her presence's steadiness. It was ridiculous. He hardly knew her. And yet, the absence of pretense in her eyes lingered longer than it should have. By the 4th night, he realized the truth he had been trying to avoid. He wanted to see her again. The irony wasn't lost on him. In his world, information came easily. Mark Vincent had to raise a hand if he wanted to know about a rival politician or business partner. Background checks arrived before he even thought to request them. Nothing was out of reach. But women. That was different. He had never been the kind of man to chase. Relationships had come to him drawn by the gravity of wealth and power. They arrived already rehearsed, armed with admiration and expectation. He had accepted them for what they were: transactions. He gave comfort, access, and luxury. In return, he received companionship that never reached beneath the surface. But Lynn Abhaya was not a transaction, and that alone terrified him. On the 5th morning, as he sat in his office high above Michigan Avenue, the restless thought pressed too insistently against his control. He reached for the phone and dialed a number he rarely used, the private line of Daniel Pierce. Mark Vincent. Daniel's voice rang with amusement on the other end. To what do I owe this rare honor? Don't tell me you're calling to thank me for attending my birthday. Mark leaned back in his leather chair, keeping his tone deliberately casual. Daniel, the photographer at your party. What was her name again? There was a pause. Then Daniel's laugh burst through the line. Mark Vincent. Are you asking about a woman? She was working, Mark said shortly. I liked her professionalism. Uh-huh. Professionalism. Daniel's chuckle lingered. Her name is Lynn Abhaya. Freelance. She's covered a few charity events for me over the years. Lives in the city. Mark said nothing, but Daniel pressed on his tone light, but edged with knowing. Be careful, my friend. Lynn isn't like the women you're used to. She doesn't care about bank accounts or skyscrapers. She has this way of making you feel like she sees you. Mark's throat tightened, though his voice remained even. Send me her contact information. I'll text it to you, Daniel replied, still laughing. Though I'll admit I never thought I'd see the day when Vincent asked me for a woman's number. Mark ended the call without indulging the banter. But for a long moment afterwards, he sat silently staring at the phone as if it had betrayed him. It was one thing to remember her, another thing to admit even silently that he wanted her in his orbit again. He didn't call her right away. That would have been too obvious, too reckless. Instead, he waited 3 days. 3 days of telling himself it was unnecessary, that he could let it go, that distraction had no place in his life. But on the 4th morning, as he reviewed preparations for an upcoming gala hosted by the Vincent Foundation, the thought slipped into action before he could resist. Elaine, he said to his assistant without looking up from his notes. Book a photographer for the gala. Elaine adjusted her glasses, pen poised. Any preferences? Yes, he said, his tone clipped. Lynn Abhaya. There was a pause. He could feel her eyes on him, skeptical. Mr. Vincent, she said carefully, this isn't one of our usual high-end photographers. She's different. I'm aware, he said curtly. Book her. Elaine made a note without further comment, though he caught the faintest hint of a knowing smile at the corner of her mouth. And just like that, the decision was made. The night arrived sooner than expected. The gala was held at one of his properties, a towering glass and marble venue that overlooked the glittering spread of Chicago's skyline. The city lights shimmered beyond floor-to-ceiling windows. Servers in white gloves moved silently with trays of champagne, while a jazz trio played soft, unobtrusive notes. Mark arrived early, as was his habit when control mattered. His suit was black, perfectly cut, his expression carefully unreadable. He intended to greet the most influential guests, ensure the evening began smoothly, and only then, seek her out. But fate once again had other plans. She was already there. By the bar, adjusting her camera settings, her navy dress was striking yet straightforward against the sleek backdrop of marble and glass. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, this time a softer frame for her alert, steady eyes. When she noticed him, she smiled, the same unguarded smile that had unsettled him a week ago. Mr. Vincent, she greeted, inclining her head. Ms. Abhaya. He returned, his voice steady, though something inside him shifted. Thank you for coming. Of course, she replied. It's a beautiful space. The light's perfect for evening shots. She turned back to her camera, adjusting the lens with practiced ease. Mark watched unbidden, noting how entirely absorbed she was in her work. No pretense, no flattery, just focus. And already he knew bringing her here was more than an excuse. It was inevitable. Throughout the evening, Mark observed her in fragments. She moved with quiet purpose, slipping unobtrusively through the crowd, capturing laughter gestures, moments too small for most to notice. Her presence shifted the room in subtle ways. People relaxed in front of her lens, their smiles genuine, their poses natural. Even Mark himself felt less guarded when her camera turned in his direction. At one point during a lull, she approached him. "Can I get a few shots of you?" she asked. The host is part of the story. He gave her a dry look. "You think people want to see my face?" Her eyes held his. "People want to see the person behind the event." For a long moment he said nothing. Then, almost against his own will, he inclined his head, and so she lifted the camera. The click of the shutter was soft, rhythmic, almost intimate. She didn't direct or ask him to tilt his head or adjust his posture. She let him stand as he was, her gaze meeting his between shots, steady and unflinching. When she lowered the camera, she asked softly, "The scar, was it from an accident?" The question struck him like a blade, not for its cruelty, but its rarity. No one asked. No one dared. They pretended not to notice, as though their silence could erase what was carved into his skin. "Yes," he said after a pause. "I was 17. My fault. I hit black ice." She nodded, not flinching, not pitying. That must have been hard. It was, he admitted, surprising himself. Harder afterwards. People change around you. Her voice was quiet, steady. "I know what you mean. Different reason, but I get it. Being a black woman in this industry, I find it a constant fight to be taken seriously. People assume I'm inexperienced, or only here because someone wanted diversity in the room. It's exhausting." For a moment, the noise of the gala faded. They stood together in the hum of the city's music and laughter, their words raw, unpolished, too honest for the setting. And Mark, for the first time in decades, didn't mind. The following weeks unfolded with an unfamiliar rhythm for Mark Vincent. It began quietly. At first, he convinced himself there was reason enough. The Vincent Corporation was preparing a series of press releases showcasing new developments across the city. Photographs were necessary, sharp, elegant images that could capture the essence of steel and glass. And so his assistant Elaine found herself repeating the same instruction. "Book Lynn Abhaya." By the third assignment, she no longer raised an eyebrow. She only wrote the name, her expression tinged with amusement and suspicion. Mark ignored it. He told himself he was being practical. She was good at her job, better than most. She captured not just the cold weight of architecture, but the life that passed between it, the way light fell across a lobby, the subtle presence of people moving through space. She had an eye for authenticity. But authenticity wasn't what drew him back again and again. It was her. Their meetings became frequent enough that he could no longer pretend otherwise. She would arrive at his office, or a construction site, camera in hand, moving with her quiet efficiency. Sometimes they spoke only about the work, the angle of a skyline, the way glass caught the sun, the symmetry of a building's facade. But other times the conversation strayed. They spoke about trivialities, the chaos of Chicago traffic, the impossibility of finding decent coffee in specific neighborhoods, her mild obsession with jazz records. He found himself smiling at her dry humor, surprised by the sound of his laughter. Then there were moments when the air between them grew heavier. She would ask something simple, unexpected, and his carefully constructed defenses would falter. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked once, adjusting her lens. "Tired of what?" "Being the man everyone expects you to be." The question lingered long after she'd left that day. He never had an answer. One evening, they had been photographing a newly completed waterfront property. The sky had been clear when they arrived, but dark clouds gathered above Lake Michigan as dusk fell. By the time they finished, rain had begun to fall, sharp, relentless sheets of silver against the city lights. Lynn laughed as she ran toward her car, shielding her camera beneath her coat. Her little hatchback sat at the edge of the lot, its windshield already blurred with rain. "You'll never make it home in this storm," Mark said as he caught up to her. His Bentley waited nearby, sleek and dry under the careful hands of his driver. "I'll be fine," she insisted, tugging at her keys. "This old thing's survived worse." "I insist," he said, opening the passenger door to his car. His tone was quiet, but resolute, the kind of tone that left no room for argument. For a moment she hesitated, then exhaled and relented. "Fine, but only because I don't want to ruin my camera." They slid into the Bentley. Inside, the air was warm, cocooned against the storm outside. Soft jazz played through the speakers, the notes weaving between the rhythm of rain pelting the glass. For a while, they drove in silence. The city stretched itself in blurred colors beyond the windows. Streetlights bleeding into puddles, neon signs distorted by water. Lynn leaned her head back against the seat watching the storm. "Chicago looks different in the rain," she murmured. Mark glanced at her. "How so?" "Less sharp, less sure of itself. Like even the strongest city has to surrender sometimes." He said nothing, but her words lingered. When they reached her apartment building, she surprised him. "Do you want to come up? Just for tea? To get you out of the rain?" Mark hesitated. No one invited him in so casually. His life was filled with Gates reservations and appointments, scheduled weeks in advance. Intimacy was a rare commodity, usually orchestrated, never spontaneous. But with Lynn, hesitation felt out of place. "Yes," he said. Her apartment was nothing like his. Modest, yes, but alive. The walls were adorned with framed photographs, some professional sharp with artistry, others personal snapshots of friends' streets travels. Plants crowded every corner, their green leaves vibrant against warm-toned walls. Books spilled from shelves and stacked along the coffee table, well-worn and loved. The air carried the faint scent of cinnamon. "This is—" Mark paused, searching for the word. Cluttered, she offered with a grin. "Lived in," he said. And for a man whose home was as pristine as a museum, the phrase held unexpected weight. She disappeared briefly into the kitchen and returned with 2 mugs of tea, steam curling into the air. They sat on her small couch, the rain tapping insistently against the windows. It was strange, he thought. In boardrooms, he commanded silence. His presence bent the air around him, made men shift uncomfortably in their seats. Yet he felt no need to dominate in this room filled with plants and books. For once he felt at ease. They talked as the rain softened outside. He told her almost without meaning to about his failed attempt to grow bonsai trees years ago. She laughed, delighted at the thought of Vincent the Iron King struggling over tiny plants. She confessed to her disaster in the kitchen once, when she had tried to cook paella and ended up with a charred, unrecognizable mess. "My landlord knocked on the door because he thought something was on fire," she admitted, laughing until her eyes watered. And then, in the quiet that followed their laughter, there was a pause. Their eyes met. For a fleeting moment, Mark considered leaning in, bridging the space between them. He could almost feel the warmth of her breath, the pull of something unnamed, but undeniable. But years of restraint anchored him. He tightened his grip on the mug, finished his tea, and stood. "Thank you," he said, his voice low for the tea. She smiled softly, as if she knew more than he had spoken. "Any time." As he stepped back into the storm, her laughter lingered in his mind, echoing louder than the rain. Back in his penthouse, Mark poured himself a scotch he had not drunk that night. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city sprawled out beneath him, restless and glittering. But the room felt emptier than usual. He thought of her apartment, warm, chaotic, alive. He thought of the books piled high, the plants reaching for light, the photographs layered with stories. And he thought of her smile, steady and unpretentious, the kind of smile that could anchor even the most unsettled man. He had built walls around himself for years, convinced no one could breach them. But now, cracks had begun to form. The scar on his face was still there, carved into his skin. But for the first time in decades, he wondered if it might not be the only thing people could see, or perhaps the only thing he allowed them to see. The Vincent Foundation Gala was never intended to be intimate. It was an annual affair carefully constructed to display generosity while reinforcing its benefactors' influence. The venue, a glass-domed hall in the heart of Chicago, had been transformed into a cathedral of light. Chandeliers dripped crystal above white linen tables, servers moved in precise choreography, and the air hummed with Chicago's most powerful voices. For Vincent, this was routine. These gatherings were another stage, Another set of transactions clothed in polite conversation and champagne. He was accustomed to them. The weight of stares, the guarded smiles, the subtle nods of respect edged with curiosity. But tonight, something was different. Because Lynn was there. Lynn. He noticed her when he arrived, though she had been at work long before him. She crept, adjusting her camera settings, circling the room unobtrusively. Her navy dress brushed against her knees as she leaned forward to capture a candid moment, the loose fall of her hair catching light whenever she tilted her head. To most, she blended seamlessly into the background. Guests barely noticed her, as she slipped between tables, her presence as natural as the flicker of candlelight. But for Mark, her every movement drew his attention. And more than once, he caught her watching him, not with the cautious curiosity of strangers, but with a steadiness that unsettled him. The Ice King, as they called him, was not accustomed to such eyes. It was midway through the evening when she approached him. The crowd had shifted toward the dance floor, leaving a quiet lull near the far window. She stepped into that space, camera in hand, her expression calm but purposeful. "Can I take a few shots of you?" He raised a brow. "Me? The host is part of the story," she said. A faint edge of irony touched his voice. "You think people want to see my face?" Her gaze didn't waver. "People want to see the person behind the event." He studied her, the weight of her words sinking deeper than he liked to admit. Then, almost against his better judgment, he gave a single nod. She lifted the camera. The shutter clicked softly, steadily, rhythmically. Unlike other photographers, she didn't direct him, didn't tell him to tilt his chin or stand taller or soften his expression. She allowed him to stand exactly as he was, her lens capturing not the mask he wore, but something beneath it. Between shots, her eyes met his. And though the camera was what separated them, he felt exposed. When she lowered the camera, her voice was quiet. "The scar. Was it from an accident?" For a moment, silence hung heavy between them. No one asked him that. No one dared. They pretended it wasn't there, as though ignoring it could erase it from his face. For years he had lived with the unspoken agreement they would not ask and he would not tell. "Yes," he said finally, his tone measured but low. "I was 17, my fault. I hit black ice." Her gaze softened, but she did not look away. "That must have been hard." It was, he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. "But harder afterwards. People change around you. They look at you differently. And once they do, you start to look at yourself differently too." She nodded, her voice steady. "I know what you mean. Different reason, but I get it." He frowned slightly. "What reason?" Lynn shifted the camera against her hip, her eyes holding his as a black woman in this industry. "It's a constant fight to be taken seriously. People assume I'm inexperienced or that I'm only here to fill some diversity quota. Every time I walk into a room, I know what they see before I open my mouth. It's exhausting." The words were simple, but their weight was undeniable. And in them, Mark felt a mirror, different scars, different stories, but the same relentless experience of being reduced to something less human. For the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. The evening moved forward, but the conversation lingered in his mind like a quiet storm. He found himself watching her differently. Not just how she worked, though. There was elegance, but how she inhabited her space. She didn't fight for attention, posture, or bend to the room's expectations. She was. And in a world where everyone around him wore masks, her authenticity was disarming. He noticed how she smiled at guests, not out of obligation, but because she genuinely meant it. He saw how she calmed a nervous intern by touching their shoulders, speaking softly until their posture eased. He noticed how she treated every person she encountered with equal regard, whether they were a CEO in a tailored suit or a server balancing a tray. Vincent, who had spent years convincing himself that connection was an illusion, felt the cracks widening in his carefully built armor. Later, when the gala ended and the last guests drifted into the night, Mark remained behind under the pretense of overseeing the staff. Lynn was packing her equipment carefully, tucking lenses into her bag, her movements unhurried. He approached, though he wasn't sure why. "You were right," he said quietly. She looked up. "About what?" "People do want to see the person behind the event." His voice was softer now, almost reluctant. "You made me forget for a moment what they usually see." Her expression gentled, though she didn't press him further. That could be what photography is, reminding people that there's always more beneath the surface. He held her gaze, and for a fleeting moment, the room felt stripped of everything else, the glittering chandeliers, the marble, the city beyond the glass. There was only her. Then, as if realizing the weight of the silence, he stepped back. "Thank you for your work tonight." "Of course," she said. But when she turned away, Mark felt a faint pull in his chest, an ache he hadn't expected. Back in his penthouse, he poured himself another drink. He didn't finish that night. He stood by the window, staring at the endless lights below. But what he saw wasn't the city. It was her eyes, steady, unflinching. The sound of her voice, as she spoke of exhaustion, of being underestimated, of knowing what it was to be diminished before being known. And it was the question she had asked, so ordinary and yet so revolutionary. Was it from an accident? 14 words that had cut through decades of silence. No one had ever asked. Not like that. For years he had been defined by what others assumed, so he had stopped offering anything more. But she had asked not out of curiosity, not out of cruelty, but out of genuine interest. She had not recoiled from his scar, or pretended it wasn't there. She had acknowledged it. And in doing so, she had acknowledged him. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Vincent felt the unfamiliar stirrings of being seen. He should have left it there. He should have let the night be what it was, a professional exchange, a fleeting conversation, a momentary lapse in his discipline. But as dawn crept into the sky, painting his penthouse in pale light, he knew he wouldn't. Because curiosity had become something else, something heavier, something far more dangerous. He wanted to hear her voice again, to see her smile that wasn't bought or rehearsed, to sit in her presence and forget, if only briefly, the role he had been forced to play for so long. The Ice King had lived decades in the fortress of his silence. But now, with every glance, every word, every photograph, Lynn Abhaya was teaching him something he had almost forgotten. That perhaps even the most scarred man could still be worth knowing. Vincent had always lived his life in carefully measured steps. Every decision was weighed, every word was considered, and every move was calculated precisely. Yet over the next few weeks, something began to shift. The precision remained, but it no longer belonged entirely to the boardroom. It belonged increasingly to Lynn Abhaya. It began with small justifications, projects that didn't require documentation. Yet he insisted they required professional photography. "Have Ms. Abhaya photograph the new lobby renovations," he told Elaine. Elaine looked up from her notepad, one brow arched. "Sir, the lobby hasn't been open to the public for another 3 months. Then we'll need promotional materials ready in advance," he replied smoothly, not missing a beat. The following week, he instructed book her for the West Loop development. "I want interior shots." Elaine tapped her pen against the desk. "The units aren't furnished yet." "What exactly is she meant to photograph the spaces?" He said, his tone final. "Higher staging if necessary." Elaine, to her credit, asked no more questions, but her knowing silence lingered. Mark, of course, ignored it. He told himself these excuses were reasonable. Lynn's work was excellent. Her photographs carried authenticity, a warmth that no other professional managed to capture. That was all. But in the quiet hours of the evening, standing alone in his penthouse, he admitted what he wouldn't say aloud. It wasn't the photographs he wanted. It was her. Each meeting began with formality. Lynn would arrive with her camera bag slung across her shoulder, her hair tied back neatly, her stride brisk and professional. She spoke to him about light angles, perspectives, and timing. But somehow, inevitably, their conversations always slipped beyond work. Once, as she was adjusting her lens in his office, she glanced at the shelves lining the wall. "You don't read these, do you?" she asked, tilting her head at the rows of pristine, leather-bound books. "They're decorative," he admitted, his lips curving faintly. She laughed, a sound that filled the room more warmly than sunlight. "I knew it. Books are meant to be dog-eared, not dusted." Another time when they were walking through a property together, she asked him a question so unexpectedly that he nearly stumbled. "Do you ever take photographs yourself?" "No," he said without hesitation. "Why not?" His eyes flicked toward her. "I don't capture. I control." The answer was sharper than he intended, but she didn't recoil. She nodded as though she understood. And once, while rain streaked his office windows late one afternoon, she asked something that lodged itself deep in his chest. "Do you ever feel lonely?" The word hung between them, dangerous and fragile. He opened his mouth to deny it, brush it aside, and shield himself behind the armor of indifference. But then he met her gaze, steady, unflinching, and the lie collapsed. "Yes," he said quietly. She didn't respond with pity. She only gave a slight nod, as if his honesty was enough. And at that moment, he realized how rarely he allowed himself to speak the truth out loud. It was strange the way she drew laughter out of him. At first, it startled him. The sound was foreign to his ears. He was not a man who laughed easily nor often. His reputation thrived on severity, on silence that froze negotiations and instilled unease. But with Lynn, laughter came unbidden. Once, when she tripped over a cable during a shoot and muttered curses under her breath, he couldn't help the chuckle that escaped him. She looked up wide-eyed, then grinned. "Did Mark Vincent laugh at me?" "I was laughing near you," he corrected dryly, but the smile tugging at his mouth betrayed him. Another time, she teased him mercilessly about his wardrobe. "Do you wear anything that isn't charcoal, navy, or black?" "It projects authority," he replied evenly. "It projects boredom," she countered, and for the first time in years, he laughed until the tension in his chest loosened. Her laughter, he realized, was even more dangerous than her eyes. It disarmed him, stripping away layers of armor he hadn't realized he still carried. It was late one evening when the line between them blurred further. They had spent the day photographing the interiors of a downtown property, and by the time they finished, the sky had darkened. The rain that had threatened all afternoon finally broke, pouring silver torrents across the streets. He said, "Let me drive you home again," echoing that earlier night. She hesitated only briefly before accepting. The Bentley hummed through the rain-slicked streets, the windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken things. When they reached her building, she invited him up once more. "Just tea," she said lightly. "I won't let you leave in this storm without something warm." Her apartment was the same as before, warm, colorful, alive with plants and books. But tonight, the atmosphere felt different. The storm outside seemed to press against the walls, heightening the intimacy of the small space. They sat on the couch again, mugs in hand. Conversation flowed easily, too easily. They spoke of trivial things at first, the worst coffee in Chicago, her dream of traveling to Morocco, his disdain for social media. Then silence settled. Not uncomfortable silence, but charged. She leaned back, curling her legs beneath her, her eyes resting on him with a quiet intensity. He set his mug down, fingers brushing against hers briefly. The contact was accidental, but it lingered like a spark. His gaze fell to her lips, soft and curved, then lifted back to her eyes. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. He thought about leaning in, about closing the distance that had stretched taut between them for weeks. The storm outside seemed to urge it, thunder rolling like a drumbeat. But restraint was muscle deep in him. Years of disciplined denial and fear tightened around him like chains. Instead, he stood. "I should go," he said quietly. Something flickered across her face. Disappointment quickly masked. She rose as well, walking him to the door. "Thank you," he murmured. "For the tea." Her smile was gentle, steady. "Anytime." When he stepped out into the rain, he felt the storm less on his skin than in his chest. Back in his penthouse, drenched and restless, Mark stood before the great expanse of glass that overlooked the city. Chicago sprawled beneath him, brilliant and unyielding, but his thoughts were far from steel and light. He thought of her laugh, unguarded and unrestrained. He thought of the warmth of her apartment, the scent of cinnamon and earth, the green leaves brushing against the window. He thought of the brief touch of her fingers, accidental yet electric. He had been untouched for years, not by hands, laughter, or anything tangible. But now her presence lingered like the storm itself, impossible to ignore. And in that echo he knew, this was no longer a distraction. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Something he wasn't sure he could control. It happened on a Wednesday morning. The photograph was harmless, nothing more than a moment captured outside a gallery opening the previous week. Mark and Lynn standing close enough that his hand rested lightly against the small of her back as they spoke. They weren't embracing, weren't kissing. It was the kind of image one might overlook entirely. But the headline stripped away all innocence, Beauty and the Beast. Vincent's new flavor. The article that followed was worse. Pages of speculation dripping with cruelty, disguised as curiosity. Her name is bold, and her photographs were pulled from social media and dissected as evidence of ambition. An up-and-coming freelance photographer, the writers sneered, whose latest subject happens to be one of Chicago's wealthiest and most elusive men. Her motives were questioned. Her reputation was dragged through the mud. They spoke of him too, but not with surprise. For Mark, Vincent ridicule was an old companion. The article called him scarred, ruthless, and a man who could buy companionship but never earn it. They had written versions of that story 100 times. But for Lynn, this was different. She had never asked for the spotlight. And yet here it was, searing, unrelenting. She read the piece once, then again slower. The words cut deeper with each line. She closed her laptop, her hands trembling, despite her effort to remain steady. It wasn't the accusations that wounded her. She had grown used to judgment, used to whispers about her skin, her gender, her place in a world that often overlooked women like her. What hurt was the thought of what this would do to him. Mark lived fiercely private, his walls higher than the skyscrapers he owned. He had allowed her a glimpse beyond them, a fragile space where honesty had been possible. And now, with one article, that space could collapse. Her phone lay silent on the coffee table. No messages, no calls. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring at the plants in her apartment, their green leaves brushing against the window. For the first time, the warmth of her home felt fragile, like a sanctuary about to be breached. And she wondered if the storm outside was only beginning. When Lynn closed her laptop, Mark had already seen the article. It had been forwarded to him by 3 different associates before his first cup of coffee. He didn't open it right away. He didn't need to. He knew what it would say. He had seen this script before, written about him, written about women who drifted briefly into his orbit. But when he finally clicked the link, something twisted deep in his chest. Not because of what they said about him. He had endured worse. but because they had written about her, Lynn. They had called her opportunistic, accused her of social climbing, and painted her presence at his side as calculated. They had taken her photographs, moments of light of authenticity, and weaponized them against her. And she hadn't asked for any of it. She hadn't sought the attention, hadn't angled for it, hadn't wanted it. He knew that. He had seen it in her eyes, heard it in her voice. And yet because of him, she was now reduced to a headline. The guilt was unbearable. Mark Vincent had survived his life by retreating. When emotions threatened to spill over, he buried himself in work. When people reached too close, he turned cold. When pain pressed against his chest, he disappeared before it could consume him. And so he did what he had always done. He withdrew. 2 days passed, then 5, then nearly 2 weeks. He convinced himself it was for her sake. If he stepped back and severed whatever fragile bond had begun, she would be spared the cruelty of being tethered to his name. He told himself she deserved better, that her career, reputation, and life would recover faster if he weren't there to make it worse. But in truth, he was protecting himself as much as her. Because being with her meant vulnerability. It meant the possibility of rejection, the fear of being seen and discarded. And though he could endure the world's ridicule, the thought of Lynn turning away was unbearable. So he buried himself in work. He filled his calendar until dawn blurred into dusk. He poured himself into deals, negotiations, contracts, anything that kept his mind from the silence waiting at night. But no matter how many meetings he crammed into his days, the silence won. It always did. She didn't call him, didn't text. She knew better than to chase someone who had vanished into silence. And yet every time her phone buzzed, her heart lurched before disappointment settled. She half expected to see him waiting at her door every time she returned home. But the days stretched on empty. She told herself she was foolish to have believed. That perhaps she had misread him, the softness she thought she had glimpsed beneath the ice. And yet, she couldn't forget the sound of his laugh, the rare vulnerability in his voice when he admitted to loneliness, the way he had stood in her apartment, awkward and unaccustomed, yet somehow at home. She told herself to let it go, but her heart refused. For Mark, the absence was louder than any presence had ever been. He missed her in ways he didn't understand. He missed the steadiness of her gaze, the warmth of her voice, the ease she carried in spaces where he felt nothing but walls. He missed the sound of her laughter, sharp and genuine, cutting through the cold silence of his life. He missed the cinnamon in her apartment, the plants brushing against the light, the cluttered comfort, so unlike the sterile emptiness of his penthouse. And late at night, staring at his untouched glass of scotch, he realized something devastating. He wasn't avoiding her for her sake. He was avoiding her for his own. Because wanting her meant risking something he hadn't risked in decades, being seen and being known and perhaps being rejected. But the thought of losing her, the possibility that she might now believe he was like everyone else, that he had abandoned her out of suspicion instead of fear, gnawed at him until the silence became unbearable. It was her birthday when the dam finally broke. He hadn't planned it. He hadn't sent flowers through an assistant or arranged a courier with an expensive gift. Those were gestures the Ice King would have made impersonal and distant. Instead, he found himself in his car, rain clinging to the dark coat draped across his shoulders. He told his driver the address he had memorized weeks ago. When the knock came, Lynn was at home, curled up with a book. She opened the door to find him standing there, tall, rain-soaked, his hair damp, his eyes shadowed. "Mark," she said softly, surprise lacing her voice. "What are you doing here?" He took a breath, steadying himself against the tide of fear inside. His voice was low, raw, I owe you an apology. Her brow furrowed. You've been gone for 2 weeks. No calls. No explanation. What did that feel like? He admitted, I thought I was protecting you, his hand raking through his wet hair. From the media. From my world. From me. Her eyes narrowed, hurt shimmering beneath them. You thought disappearing would protect me. I didn't know what else to do, he confessed. His voice cracked not loudly, but enough to betray the truth. I've spent years keeping people at a distance because it's easier than letting them close. Easier than finding out they never wanted me. Just what I could give them. Her gaze softened, but she did not step closer. And you think I'm like that? No. His voice was fierce, now urgent. That's the problem. Lynn, you're the first person who's made me feel human in decades, and it terrifies me. Because if I lose you, I don't know if I can return to the way things were before. The silence that followed was thick with everything unspoken. The storm outside pounded against the windows, but neither of them moved. And then slowly she closed the space between them. Her voice was gentle, almost a whisper. Mark, you're not the sum of your scars. Not the one on your face, not the ones you keep hidden inside. I'm not afraid of them. I need to know you won't run whenever you're scared. His throat tightened, the weight of years pressing against him. I'll try, he murmured. God, I'll try. And when she kissed him, soft at first, then deeper, his walls cracked wide open. The Ice King melted, if only for that moment. The kiss had not solved everything. If anything, it made everything sharper, more real, more fragile. It was no longer a possibility, hovering at the edge of silence. It had become a truth, undeniable and alive. For Mark Vincent, that truth was both exhilarating and terrifying. In the following days, he reached for his phone without thinking, composing messages only to delete them, dialing her number to hang up before the first ring. But then he would see her, because he made sure he did. No longer under the guise of endless projects, but because he wanted her near. And when she was, the world shifted. They fell into a rhythm, unspoken, but steady. She would sometimes join him for coffee in the mornings, her laughter softening the edges of his meticulously ordered days. He would stop by her apartment in the evenings, where they sat on her couch and spoke of nothing important, until silence carried more weight than words. He brought her into his world, slowly, cautiously. A dinner with Daniel Pierce and his wife, where Lynn's wit disarmed Daniel, and her warmth charmed everyone else at the table. A walk along the lakefront, where the wind tangled her hair. He smiled, more than he had in years. She in turn invited him into hers. The music pulsed low and steady in an afternoon at a jazz cafe in a quiet corner of Bronzeville. A gathering with her closest friends, artists, and musicians who greeted him not as a billionaire, but as Lynn's companion. For the first time, he was introduced not with awe or calculation, but with genuine welcome. And yet, beneath the sweetness of these days, a shadow loomed. The world noticed. It always did. First, it was the discreet glances at charity events, the flicker of curiosity when Mark entered a room with Lynn by his side. Then came the murmurs slipping like smoke through the circles of Chicago's elite. She was too different, they said. Too ordinary. Too ambitious. Too bold. Too not his type. The whispers reached the press again, though not with scandalous cruelty, but with subtle poison. Columns speculated about how long it would last, how soon she would tire of the shadows of his scar, or how soon he would tire of her simplicity. Mark heard the whispers, though no one dared speak them directly to his face. He had been feared too long and respected deeply in business to invite such boldness. But he saw it in their eyes. The way they lingered on her, measuring her worth, searching for cracks. And for the first time, he found himself caring not about their judgment of him, but about the weight it placed on her. It came to a head at a fundraising gala, hosted by one of Chicago's most influential families. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and gold leaf, the air perfumed with wealth and expectation. Mark arrived with Lynn on his arm, her hand resting lightly against his sleeve. Her black silk gown, elegant but straightforward. She did not compete with the extravagance around her, which made her presence more striking. They moved through the room together, his posture as commanding as always hers, steady and unpretentious. But everywhere they went, eyes followed. Whispers trailed. At one point, a woman with diamonds at her throat leaned just close enough for her words to carry. She's brave. I'll give her that. To stand next to him and pretend it's love. Lynn heard it. Mark saw the flicker in her expression, how she steadied herself, shoulders squared, but chin lifted. Something in him hardened. He turned his voice low, but carrying enough weight to silence the air around them. Pretend. The woman startled, flushing. Mr. Vincent. But he didn't let her finish. He placed his hand over Lynn's firm, steady. There's no pretense here, only truth, something you clearly wouldn't recognize if it stood before you. The silence followed was thick, broken only by the strains of a distant violin. The whispers erupted again when he led Lynn away, but different now, sharper, shocked. Because Mark Vincent, the Iron King, had never defended anyone so openly. Later that night, as they drove home silently, Lynn stared out at the city lights, her reflection blurred against the car window. She said you didn't have to do that, her voice soft. I did, he answered. She turned toward him, searching his face. You've spent your whole life ignoring them. Why now? His gaze met hers, steady. Because it's no longer just about me. Her breath caught, though she said nothing. In the quiet that followed, his hand found hers, their fingers intertwining against the leather seat. Later that week she wandered through the vast space at his penthouse, her fingers brushing against the cold marble counters, the immaculate glass walls, and the art that seemed more curated than lived with. This place feels like a museum, she said softly. It is, he replied. A museum of everything I thought I needed. And now she asked. His eyes lingered on her, the way her presence seemed to soften the sharp edges of the room. Now I know I was wrong. She smiled, then not triumphant, but tender. And when she kissed him, it was not with the tentative hesitancy of their first, but with the assurance of something building, something real. For Mark, the world outside still whispered. But inside, in these private certainties, he no longer heard them. Of course, the world did not stop. The press continued to speculate. Business associates asked careful questions. Even some within his circle hinted that such a relationship could be a liability, a distraction, or a weakness. But Mark Vincent was a man who had built empires out of stone and steel. And when he decided to stand, nothing could move him. So he stood. He appeared with Lynn at events, not as a shadow at his side, but as his equal. He introduced her by name, with a quiet pride that left little room for doubt. He ignored the murmurs, silenced the questions with a single glance. And slowly, inevitably, the whispers began to shift. It rarely did not, because society had changed, but because Mark had. The Iron King was no longer untouchable. He was something far more dangerous, a man who had chosen to love despite the world's eyes upon him. One evening, weeks after the gala, they sat together in Lynn's apartment, the rain soft against the windows, the room warm with lamplight. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, their silence unforced. You know this won't get easier, she murmured. The more you stand with me, the more they'll push back. He turned, pressing a kiss to her hair. Then let them push. I've lived half my life alone behind walls. I won't spend the rest hiding from the only thing that's ever felt real. Her fingers tightened around his, and in the quiet with the storm whispering against the glass, she let herself believe him. For the first time, she wasn't bracing for retreat. For the first time, she let herself imagine staying. Love did not arrive for Mark Vincent in a single sweeping gesture. It came instead like water, wearing down stone soft, but relentless, reshaping everything he thought unchangeable. It showed itself in mornings that began differently, no longer with silence and coffee alone at a glass table, but with the memory of her voice still echoing from the night before. He glanced at his watch in the afternoons, not for meetings, but for the thought of when he might see her again. And in evenings, when the penthouse lights glowed against the city, but felt less cold because she was there, curling her legs beneath her on his couch, filling the air with warmth that no architect could design. For years, Mark had only known one rhythm: marble floors, glass walls, endless towers of steel. His companions were men who spoke in numbers, and women who smiled in calculation. His city was sharp, unyielding. But Lynn's Chicago was different. One Saturday afternoon, she invited him to a block party in Bronzeville, where music spilled from open windows and children ran through sprinklers on cracked sidewalks. The smell of barbecue drifted through the air, and strangers greeted her by name, their smiles wide and unguarded. Mark stood out impossibly, so his tailored suit, his guarded expression, the scar that drew glances. Yet beside Lynn, he felt less like a monument and more like a man. She introduced him with no fanfare, no weight of reputation. "This is Mark," she said. "This is Mark's hand." He laughed with him and teased him like he was any other. He found himself holding a paper plate of ribs, standing beneath string lights, listening to jazz played not by professionals, but by neighbors who loved the sound. And when Lynn pulled him into a circle of dancing, he resisted for only a moment before giving in. His steps were stiff and awkward, but her laughter lit the night, and he let himself move to the rhythm unpracticed but unafraid. It was, he realized, the first time in years he had been touched by joy that asked for nothing in return. In turn, he brought her deeper into his. She sat beside him at board dinners, unflinching under the weight of eyes that measured her with quiet judgment. She did not shrink, nor did she posture. She listened and spoke when she wished her words sharp and intelligent, but free of pretense. He noticed how it unsettled them, how she refused to play their games, and carried herself with honesty instead of artifice. And though whispers still curled through the air, he found that he no longer cared, because while others spoke of power, he sat beside the only person whose presence made the word irrelevant. Yet the world beyond them was not so easily silenced. At a corporate gala one evening, a fellow executive pulled Mark aside, his tone wrapped in the thin veneer of concern. "Vincent," he said, his glass of champagne catching the light, "you know I respect you, but this woman, she isn't suited for our circles. People are starting to question your judgment." Mark's reply was cool, but edged with steel. "Then let them question." The man shifted uncomfortably. "It's not about you, Mark. It's about her. Do you think she'll withstand the pressure, the scrutiny? She's not like us." Mark's gaze sharpened. "That's precisely why she's worth more than any of us." He left the man speechless, but the words lingered in his mind long after, because though he did not doubt Lynn's strength, he feared the world's cruelty. He had lived beneath its eyes for decades. He knew how relentless they could be. Lynn too felt it. She never told him directly, but he saw it in her silence after certain events, in the way she leaned against him, with a weariness that was not physical. He heard it in the questions her friends asked her, gently, cautiously. "Are you sure this is what you want?" and in how strangers looked at them together, sometimes curious, sometimes disapproving, sometimes merely surprised. The weight of difference pressed around them. Race, wealth, power. The world measured these things ruthlessly, and though they rarely spoke of it, both felt its presence. Yet every time doubt crept in, the simplest things undid it, the way her laughter filled his kitchen, the way his hand found hers without thought, the way silence between them felt like belonging, not emptiness. But Mark was not immune to old habits. One evening, after another article surfaced, nothing vicious but sly enough to sting, he found himself pacing his penthouse, anger burning low in his chest. He poured a glass of scotch, then left it untouched on the counter. When Lynn arrived, he was distant, his words clipped. She watched him silently for a while before speaking. "You're doing it again," she said softly. "Doing what, building walls?" He froze, the truth striking deeper than he expected. She crossed the room, standing before him with steady eyes. "You think that if you close yourself off, you'll protect me. But that's not what I need, Mark. I don't need you to hide. I need you to stand." His throat tightened. "And if standing costs you everything?" Her smile was small, but unwavering. "Then at least it's ours to decide, not theirs." Something in him gave way then. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were the only anchor in a world trying to drag him back into silence. Their love grew not in grand gestures, but in the quiet. In the mornings he brewed her tea just how she liked it, despite once claiming he never touched a kettle. In the afternoons, she dragged him through a flea market, laughing at how out of place he looked among stalls of handmade jewelry and vintage records. In evenings, when she sat curled against him, reading aloud from dog-eared novels, her voice weaving warmth into his sterile rooms. And each moment built something stronger than defense, something that felt unbreakable. Yet the world was relentless. At a press conference weeks later, a reporter asked the question openly. His tone was polite, but the words were sharp. "Mr. Vincent, how do you respond to those who say your relationship with Ms. Abhaya distracts you from your responsibilities, that it's unbecoming of someone in your position?" The room stilled. Cameras flashed. The question was meant to corner him. Mark's answer was calm, but his voice carried steel. "My responsibilities are clear. My work speaks for itself. As for Ms. Abhaya, she is not a distraction. She is the only reason I remember what all of this is for." The silence that followed was profound. Then the questions shifted. The conference moved on, but the moment remained. Because for the first time, Mark Vincent had not only acknowledged Lynn publicly, he had claimed her. That evening, as they stood on her balcony overlooking the city, Lynn turned to him, her eyes luminous in the glow of streetlights below. "You didn't have to say that," she whispered. "Yes," he said. "I did." Her fingers brushed his scar, gentle, reverent. "Do you regret it?" He caught her hand, pressing it to his face. "The only thing I regret is not finding you sooner." The city moved below them, restless and bright. But up there they stood still. Two souls bound, not by circumstance, but by choice. And though the world might press harder, whisper louder, judge harsher, Mark knew one thing with unshakable certainty. He would not let her go. Not now. Not ever. The rooftop had changed since the night they first collided. Yet somehow it felt the same. Chicago spread wide beneath it, the skyline etched in light and shadow, Lake Michigan, glimmering faintly in the distance. The hum of the city rose like a heartbeat, steady and restless. But tonight, it belonged only to them. Lanterns hung in soft strings overhead, their golden glow swaying gently in the breeze. Flowers lined the edges of the terrace. White roses, lilies, blush peonies, arranged with care, but without extravagance. At the center stood a table draped in linen set for two. It was understated compared to the grandeur Vincent could command. No orchestras, no flashing cameras, no press. Just light flowers and memory. This place was where it began, and this night was meant only for them. Mark had never been a man of gestures. Deals, yes. Strategies, always. But he had long abandoned romance as something out of reach, a language he no longer spoke. Yet as he oversaw the preparations, he realized that what he wanted was not spectacle, but meaning. He remembered the night she had backed into him, nearly dropping her camera. How she had looked at him, truly looked, without flinching. How her voice had been warm, unhurried, unafraid. That single meeting had unraveled decades of silence. Now he wanted to give her something back. Not the world already at his fingertips, but a promise. For days he had rehearsed the words in his mind, though he knew they would falter when the moment came. He was not practiced in vulnerability. But for her, he would risk stumbling. Because Lynn Abhaya had already seen him at his most unguarded, she still stayed. She didn't know. He had told her only that they were meeting for dinner, nothing more. When she stepped onto the rooftop, her eyes widened. Mark. Her voice caught her gaze sweeping across the lanterns, the flowers and the table beneath the open sky. He stepped forward, his hand steady as it reached for hers. Do you remember this place? Her lips curved, her eyes shining. Of course. I nearly destroyed my camera here. And I nearly destroyed myself by letting you walk away. She looked up at him, startled by the rare vulnerability in his tone. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with memory. Then he guided her to the table, pulling out her chair with a quiet grace. They dined not on extravagance, but on simplicity. Her favorite dishes chosen with care, prepared by a chef he had brought in only for the night. Conversation drifted easily, though beneath every word lay the weight of what he had planned. When dessert plates had been cleared away, Mark rose. Lynn tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. What are you doing? He stood at the rooftop's edge, the city sprawling behind him, lantern light casting his features in gold and shadow. For once, he looked not like the Iron King, not like the billionaire who commanded skyscrapers, but like a man, simply a man. I've spent most of my life believing I was untouchable. He began, his voice low but steady. If I built my walls high enough, no one could hurt me. And for a long time that worked. I was safe, alone, but safe. He paused, his gaze locking with hers. Then you walked into me. Everything changed. Her lips curved, though her eyes shimmered. You looked at me like I wasn't a headline, a scar, or a name carved into steel. You saw me. Just me. And I didn't know how much I needed that until it was gone. Until you showed me. His throat tightened, the words harder now. But he pressed forward. I was afraid. Afraid I'd lose you if I let myself want and love you. And if I lost you, I didn't know if I could return to how I was before. The lantern swayed above them, the night holding its breath. But you stayed even when I pushed you away. Even when the world whispered, you stayed. And because of you, I am not the man I was. I don't want to be. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small velvet box. His hand trembled, not with uncertainty, but with the moment's gravity. Lynn Abhaya. You are the only truth I've ever known. That mattered more than everything else. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving it. Will you marry me? Her breath caught her hands trembling as she pressed them to her mouth. The city seemed to vanish for a heartbeat, the rooftop suspended in silence. Then she rose, crossing the space between them with steady steps despite the tears in her eyes. Mark. Her voice was thick, unsteady. You think you were afraid? You weren't the only one. He blinked, surprised. I was afraid too. She continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. Worried you'd wake up one day and realize I didn't belong in your world. Afraid that the whispers would break us apart. Worried that you'd run, and this time I wouldn't be able to stop you. Her hands found his, curling around them. But then you chose me. Again and again you chose me. And I realized, that's all I need. Not certainty, not perfection, just the choice, every day. She looked into his eyes, steady now, her voice sure. So, yes, Mark. Yes, I'll marry you. The relief that broke through him was unlike anything he had ever felt. The Iron King disappeared momentarily, leaving only a man undone by love. He slipped the ring onto her finger, simple, elegant, a diamond set in platinum, chosen not for its extravagance, but for its timelessness. And then he kissed her, slow and deep, lantern light, weaving around them the city sprawling below. They didn't need applause. There were no cameras, guests, or witnesses, but the stars above. When they finally sat again, hand in hand, Lynn looked at him with a smile that seemed to steady the world. You know, she murmured, for a man who doesn't believe in grand gestures, that was pretty grand. He smirked faintly. For you, I'll make exceptions. Her laughter broke the moment's intensity, light and warm, filling the rooftop with something more lasting than vows. It was not just a promise of love. It was the promise of a life lived together in laughter, struggle, and the kind of truth that had bound them since that first accidental collision. Later that night, as they drove through the city, Lynn leaned against him, her hands still curled around his. The ring glimmered faintly in the passing streetlights. For Mark, the skyline looked different, not as monuments of power or trophies of control, but as a city he could finally imagine living in, not ruling over. And for the first time in his life, the future did not feel like something to conquer. It felt like something to share. The morning of their wedding dawned with a softness that felt like a blessing. Chicago awoke beneath a golden haze, the skyline glowing like the city had chosen to celebrate. The lake mirrored the light waves rolling gently toward the shore, carrying whispers of serenity. Inside the grand hall of the Whitestone Conservatory, preparations unfolded like a symphony. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above, spilling light across ivory drapery that cascaded from the ceilings. Rows of orchids and white roses lined the aisle, their fragrance delicate yet commanding. It was a wedding fit for the powerful and the wealthy. Yet beneath all its grandeur, it held something far rarer: sincerity. Because this was not just a union of two lives, it was a triumph over silence, over fear, over whispers that had once tried to pull them apart. Lynn stood before the mirror, her gown a vision of elegance. The silk hugged her shoulders before flowing into a cascade of lace, each stitch blending strength and grace. Her hair, pinned with delicate pearl combs, framed her face with a softness that made her reflection seem unreal. Yet it was not the gown nor the jewels that made her radiant. It was the calm in her eyes, the quiet joy of a woman who had chosen love despite everything. Her closest friends surrounded her, laughter and warmth filling the room. Yet beneath their chatter, Lynn's thoughts drifted. She remembered the rooftop where Mark had asked her to marry him, lantern light dancing in his eyes. She remembered the way his voice had broken as he confessed his fears. And she remembered her trembling answer, her surrender to the truth she had long carried. Now standing here, she felt no fear, only certainty. Mark Vincent was not known for nerves. In boardrooms and negotiations, his calm was legendary, his composure unshakable. But his hands were restless as he adjusted his cufflinks in the waiting room. It wasn't doubt, not anymore. It was weight, the weight of what this day meant. He remembered when he thought happiness was a weakness, when love was an indulgence he could not afford. He had buried himself in steel and glass, convinced that walls were safer than promises. And then Lynn had walked into his life, or rather, collided into it. Now every wall he had built seemed foolish, because today he would stand before her not as the Iron King or the untouchable billionaire, but as a man who had found his heart. And for the first time in decades, he was grateful to be seen. The ceremony. The hall hushed as the music began. A soft swell of strings filled the air, carrying an unspoken anticipation. Mark stood at the altar, his eyes fixed on the doors. His breath caught as they opened. Lynn entered her steps, graceful, her gown trailing like a river of light. Every head turned, every whisper stilled. To the world she was breathtaking. To him, she was everything. Their eyes met, and the distance between them disappeared. Each step she took toward him was a step away from the loneliness that had once defined them both. When she reached him, he took her hand, steadying himself in her touch. The officiant's voice carried through the hall words of tradition laced with reverence. Yet neither Mark nor Lynn heard them fully. Their world had narrowed to each other. The warmth of her hand, the depth of his gaze, the certainty of what they were about to vow. When it was time, Lynn spoke first. Mark, when I met you, I saw a man who carried the world, but kept none of it for himself. I saw strength, yes, but also solitude. And I saw fear, the kind that hides not from others, but from love itself. You let me in, though it terrified you. You chose me again and again, even when the world told us not to belong. And in choosing me, you gave me the greatest gift, the freedom to love without apology. So today, I vow this to choose you every morning, every night, in every storm, in every calm. I promise to see you, not as the world does, but as the man you are. My partner, my heart, my home. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but her voice never faltered. Mark swallowed hard, his own words waiting trembling. Lynn, he began, his voice deep but unsteady. My life before you was made of walls. I thought safety came from distance, that strength meant never needing anyone. Then you came unexpected, unstoppable, and showed me that strength is not in solitude, but in surrender. You've seen me at my worst, and still you stayed. You've taught me that love is not a risk, but the reason to keep going. So I vow to never hide from you, never silence the truth we share. I promise to protect your heart and the life we build together. And I promise above all else to spend every day proving that you were right to believe in me. The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. When the officiant finally declared them husband and wife, Mark didn't wait. He drew her into his arms, his kiss sealing not just a promise, but a future. Applause thundered through the hall, but Mark and Lynn barely heard it. Their first dance unfolded beneath a canopy of light, the music carrying them in slow, deliberate steps. He held her close, his lips brushing her ear as he whispered words only she would hear. The world had gathered, yes, influential figures, dignitaries, curious eyes, but none of it mattered. For them, the room had vanished. Every glance, every smile, every touch spoke louder than the applause. Later, as laughter filled the hall, as glasses clinked and stories flowed, Mark and Lynn slipped onto a balcony. The city stretched before them, lights shimmering the air crisp. "Do you realize?" Lynn murmured, leaning into him. "This is just the beginning." Mark pressed his lips to her hair, his voice soft. "The beginning, and the only future I want." Their love was not perfect, nor was it meant to be. It was raw, tested, scarred by the world's judgment. But it endured, and in that endurance, it became something greater than either had imagined. Happiness was not the absence of storms, but the decision to stand together in their midst. And as they walked back into the hall hand in hand, Mark Vincent and Lynn Abhaya knew this. No matter what came, they had already won. If you've walked this journey with Mark and Lynn from heartbreak to healing, from fear to love, let their story remind you that true love is not about perfection, but about choosing each other again and again. If their vows touched your heart and courage inspired you, take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and follow our channel for more stories that will make you feel, dream, and believe in love's resilience. Every love story deserves to be told. Perhaps one we share will speak to your heart too.